Hello, folks. I hope you're all doing well and all being safe and sound and taking all the precautions that you possibly can in this very unusual time. So, I'm coming to you from my garage, the bunker, at the moment, and you can see my little pub in the background. So, this is what's getting me through safe and sane through this COVID outbreak. So, this is a very quick introduction to say what we're doing to change things a little here. So, you've moved to an online provision. I will have updated all of the material on Moodle to reflect that. So, all of the slides that were previously PowerPoint packs will now be converted into short, brief videos, just so you've got something to watch or listen to at your own leisure, and with a bit more sort of background information and detail, something akin to what we would have had in the lectures as well. So hopefully just a little bit more helpful than static PowerPoint slides for you guys. I'm available most of the time. You can either pick me up via email or you can get me via Microsoft Teams as well. So we're doing a lot of teaching on that, and we can also have correspondence via Microsoft Teams. Anything we can do to be supportive and helpful at this time, please do let us know. Obviously, we're all very concerned about your safety, health and well-being. I do hope you're all following the government guidelines, that you are social distancing and staying at home as much as you possibly can. And we do hope that you're all looking after yourselves and taking care of your loved ones as well. So as I say, any questions at all, please do just let me know through email or through Microsoft Teams. And basically now this will cycle through, we'll move immediately through on to the presentations. Hope you all enjoy, and this gives you something to do to kill the time during the lockdown. Okay, speak to you soon, guys. Okay, so this is covering off week 1, where we talked a little bit about strategic analysis. So these are the original slide decks from the actual lectures themselves. So some of this material won't fit entirely perfectly in with a video, but we'll make do as best we can with that. The most important thing is that you have some commentary over the top of this to help provide with a little bit more context and a little bit more background information for you as well as some general food for thought as we progress through. So we'll be looking at today internal analysis, the macro environment, as well as the micro environment, and how this can inform a SWOT analysis as well. So when we're looking at a marketing analysis, what we're trying to do, particularly from a strategic point of view, is look at the current position of the organization. So this is a snapshot in time as we are now. It will inform how we behave in the future, and it will obviously be informed by our past as well, but this is a cross-sectional view of the organization as it is at present. So this is very often referred to as a situational analysis. So the situational analysis is made up of 2 parts. It's made up of the internal analysis and obviously then an external analysis as well. So this diagram here, this is just to demonstrate how the strategic analysis is broken down. So the organization is obviously for part of the internal analysis, which is what we will deal with shortly. And then we have the environment that immediately surrounds the organization, the micro environment. So this is things like your customers, suppliers, competitors, all things that you can have some at least minor impact on depending on the size of the organization and the industry that you are in. And outside of this, we have the broader environment, the macro environment. So this is the grand environment in which we all operate, but things, or an environment rather, that we do not have any impact on. There is an argument to say enormous companies perhaps could affect some of these elements of the macro environment. Let's say, for instance, an enormous company like Apple has an economic impact and is therefore affecting the economy, but no one organization themselves can affect, let's say, for instance, when we might next have a financial crash or an upturn in the economy. It is made up of far too many moving parts to say that an organization can have an impact on the macro environment. So firstly, with the internal analysis, this is made up of 4 major components. First, we have the competences. So competences is just a word basically to say what you are good at, what you are capable of doing. So again, a very simple idea. Assets is what the organization owns or doesn't own or should own perhaps. So let's say, for instance, if you are a company that has a number of buildings, office buildings, or a fleet of cars, or plant material, as in heavy industry plant material. These are all different types of assets that the company might own. And then we have resources. So resources can be considered in the sense of human resources. So the people, do you have the correct sorts of people there to do the kinds of jobs that you want them to do, as well as consumables. So let's say, for instance, if you are an organization that produces electricity, a resource you would need could be coal or oil or gas. So it's a consumable resource, but not actually the end product, and different to assets in that they are actually consumed. So once the coal has produced the electricity, it's obviously no longer with us, so that is not an asset but a resource. And finally, we have the strategic capabilities. So the strategic capabilities are effectively the management that you have in place. Do you have the appropriate management structures? Do you have the appropriate management team in place? So this is for looking at the future of the organization, the direction and strategic capabilities of that company. So put together, all of these actually summarize the strengths and weaknesses of an organization, because these are internal factors. So we would have talked quite a lot in the lecture about SWOT analysis, and you've probably covered SWOT analysis through a number of other disciplines and prior to coming to university as well. But this year is specifically looking at the competencies, assets, resources, and strategic capabilities, and a summary of which is giving you the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. So what we want to do when we're looking at building up a strategy or a marketing strategy, we want to make sure that we are premising our strategy on the strengths of the company. So it is the strengths that are informing the company's strategy. Now, of course, we need to take into consideration what our weaknesses are in order that we can best mitigate these weaknesses and become a stronger organization. But we want to lead with our best foot forward when we're developing a strategy and marketing strategy, that we are premising this on the strengths of the organization. So this was our student activity. So this is something you can sort of take away and think about yourself a little bit here. Some of you might not have actually heard of the organization Blockbuster, but Blockbuster was a video rental organization that was around for a number of years and was actually quite successful during the 90s and early 2000s. And to think of some of its competencies, so again, competencies are what they are competent at as an organization, so what you're good at. But obviously when you're looking at strengths and weaknesses, you need to look what are your strong competencies and what are your weaknesses as well. So if we just go through some very quick examples here, a strength of a competence of Blockbuster could be its staff, for instance. So do they have capable staff, or are they good at having a broad range of movie titles, as a for instance. Assets was a perhaps more complicated one for Blockbuster than it is for some other organizations. So Blockbusters would have had a large number of stores on every high street up and down the country, and would have felt at the time particularly confident that this was a strength of theirs. But as you've started to see with having streaming technologies come online with Netflix and Amazon Prime, these initially, well, particularly Netflix, started out as a delivery service which Blockbuster were trying to compete with. But as this moved into a different technological era, then Blockbuster was saddled with expensive assets, having shops up and down the country. And again, then in terms of those resources, it took far more resources to run Blockbuster with a physical supply chain and with shops that needed to be heated and lit and have staff in them all year round. And in terms of strategic capabilities, what do we think in terms of the management capabilities? Should they have foreseen the revolution in streaming media, and whether that could be music or movies? Everything had started to make some sort of move into the digital realm at this point. So did they have the appropriate management team in place at that particular time? So take a little bit of time and think your way through this. Obviously you can take an opportunity to pause the videos during the activities and have a little think for yourself what you think Blockbuster have done. So the microenvironment. So as I mentioned briefly at the top of this video, the microenvironment is that is closest to the organization, and it is something that the company can have a limited impact on. So there are a number of facets that make up the microenvironment. So we'll just talk through these very quickly here. So we have customers, competitors, suppliers, distributors, retailers, and stakeholders. So stakeholders largely covers all of these in the round. So you can see how you as an organization can have an impact on your microenvironment. So as for instance, if you change your prices, for instance, that may impact how much of the product your consumers, your customers, purchase. But it also may have an impact, a knock-on impact on your competitors. Perhaps they will change their approach, perhaps they'll alter their prices as well. And again, further knock-on issues here into your suppliers. Will your suppliers then try and strike a new deal with you premised on the new prices that you are charging? So you can see how these are all interrelated and how you as an organization can have an impact on all of these various facets, and something that should be taken into consideration as part of the microenvironment analysis. So again, student activity, something you can take away for 10 minutes yourself. So a company I think we will all be familiar with is Sony. So have a little think about Sony's competitors, its customers, suppliers, stakeholders, distributors, and retailers, and consider how Sony can have an impact on each of these groups. So we mentioned earlier, perhaps lowering prices or having more of a promotion could have an impact on both the customers and the competitors as well. And what about retailers? If you're looking for prime real estate space in a retailer's store, how can you have an impact on these as well? Obviously, a major multinational like Sony is going to have quite a great deal of strength, bargaining power. How is that going to affect the suppliers and the stakeholders, and consequently the distributors as well? So again, feel free, pause the video now, have a little think, perhaps even have a discussion with some of your peers as well about what you think Sony's microenvironment is like. So clearly a virtual coffee break, so we shall skip through this slide. So here we have the macro environment. So if the microenvironment is the environment that is close to the organization, the macro environment is concerned with broader societal issues. And companies, as I said earlier on, can have no impact on that should read macro rather than micro. The company can have no impact on the macro environment. And there's a well-known model that you'll probably encounter a number of times throughout university that helps you deal with the macro environment, and that is the PESTEL analysis. So here you'll look at the political, the economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. So as I said, organizations, even huge organizations, may be part of but don't really get to form or change the macro environment. So organizations will respond to changes in the social environment. They will adopt technologies, and that will have an impact on how they run their business. Even if they are cutting edge and they are technology companies, they will not be controlling all that happens in the technological sector. In the same with political, you may have enormous companies that are trying to lobby and leverage political power, but they certainly wouldn't get to decide who wields that power. So you could be the biggest organization in the world, but you won't be able to alter the outcome of an election, for instance. So we'll very quickly look through this slide here. So this is just to give an indication of what level of involvement and exposure matters and happens in the political realm. So we have in this top left hand quadrant here the defense industry, which we can see has both high political exposure and high levels of state involvement. So if there was going to be a missile defense system, for instance, that is going to have entire state involvement, as they will be doing the purchasing, but also a great deal of political exposure. This matters to us as individuals. This will be written about in the press. You would have heard a great deal to say about the Trident defense system. But if we look at that, then the opposite quadrant on the upper side of this diagram here, the canal industry. So it'll have direct state involvement, high direct state involvement, because the canals will belong to the government in the same way that the roads would belong to the government as well. But very low political exposure, because it is not something that is having a direct and consistent impact on the rest of society in the same way that the defence industry does. So you'll see little information about the canal industry because it has a low level of political exposure. So if we compared that again more directly to the motorways, people have a far greater vested stake in the upkeep and maintenance of the main artery roads that run through the country. So that would have a much higher political exposure than the canal industry. Even if we take this down to a local government level, you're far more likely to read about potholes in your local community than you are about a problem with the canals. Similarly, you can have industries where there is lower state involvement but still high political exposure. So as again, for instance, the food industry. We want to make sure that our food is appropriately regulated. That's not to say that we want the government to be producing our food. We certainly wouldn't want to be having government bread, for instance. But we do want to make sure that that bread is produced safely and in a manner that the consumption won't damage or hurt us in any particular way. And we would have seen this high political exposure through some of the controversies that we've seen in recent years. Let's say, for instance, the horse meat scandal that we saw engulf a great deal of Europe. And then we have areas with low political exposure and low political involvement. So here the example is the hotel industry. So we wouldn't expect to go to a government-run hotel, and the exposure is low as well, largely because this is the leisure sector, and there isn't any great need for there to be any political exposure to this. So this is just a sort of high-level overview of the notion of the state involvement and political exposure. So political, in its broadest sense, can have a great deal of impact on all businesses of all stripes. So particularly here in the UK, it could be the timing of elections, or the very fact that we have elections that we'll come to in a moment, the sort of system that we have here in the UK. So businesses will behave differently around times of elections, waiting to see which political party gets into power, to see which really suits their industry best, which party is going to be more pro-business, which party is going to raise or lower the rates of taxation. How is that going to have a knock-on impact on your company or your industry or sector? There could be direct manifesto promises that political parties are making. So I myself worked in the energy industry at a time when there were a great deal of subsidies, particularly for putting solar panels on your roof, and the government would then repay a subsidy to the consumer premised on the amount of electricity they were producing. And this industry both boomed and bust as the government changed its mind on what that subsidy should be. So the political element can have a huge impact on the performances of organisations. So we have a few different examples here of different political parties, from the Liberal Democrats, Labour, Conservative, UKIP, Green Party, all of which in one way or another have an impact on how businesses are able to run. Obviously the party in power generally has the most clout, but we've seen even small political parties like UKIP, effectively a protest party, having an absolutely huge impact on where we are now politically, given that we are still in the throes of exiting the European Union. So when we say typically large organisations may be more conservative supporting, as they might have lower rates of corporation tax, or then you may have perhaps other sorts of organisations which would be more akin to supporting higher rates of taxation or different rules on labour laws, for instance. So the political party who are in power and who are the main opposition can have a great deal of impact on an organisation's performance. So I mentioned a little while ago as well the sort of left and right political spectrum and where we sit on this. So we can see with our own country here in the UK, we are a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, which in the grand scheme, I know we have open elections, but puts us generally in that sort of marginally more conservative side of things. but most of our system would sit more or less centrally, as we do have open, free and fair elections that allow us to choose the political parties that we want. And you can move further to the left, where it is like to be socialism or communism, as we see present in countries like China. And then we obviously have our far right extremes in Nazism and fascism, which fortunately we at least don't see in a formalized sense in the world today. But again, where you are in the world and what sort of system you have in place will have a marked effect on the performance of your organization and the decisions that business actually put in place to operate. So if you were looking to expand your business to an enormous market, that being China, a country of 1.4 billion people and a large middle class that is around about the size of the entire population of the United States, at rumoured somewhere between 200 and 300 million people, then the first thought might be this market is enormous and therefore a tremendous opportunity for us. But the flip side of that is, would you be able to operate in exactly the same way in a communist state that you would be able to if you were operating in a liberal democracy such as we have here in the UK? So again, where you are in the world and what political system is in place in that part of the world will have a marked impact on your organization. So again, another activity for you guys now. So this will basically be the watching of two videos. These videos are slightly out of date now, but I don't think the messaging has changed all that much from some of these political parties. I think what basically I want you to do is actually take this as a snapshot in time. So this was prior to the situation we're in presently in regards to Brexit, and there's still a lot of promises being made at this point. So what I want you to think on watching these videos is, what are the major political issues facing all British businesses at the moment? How important is it which political party is in power? And if you were a business owner at this time, which party would be best for your business and why? And let's say you are a small to medium-sized business in this instance. So you're an owner-manager of an organization that employs perhaps 50 people and turns over, let's say, £2 million a year. Which political party would you rather be in power to support the growth of your organization? So let's take a look at these videos. So, economic. Obviously, the economy has an impact on organizations and their performance, and is an important consideration for any business when carrying out a macro environment analysis. So this first graphic here, which is very crudely and rudimentarily representing the stock market, or at least the state of the economy at any one given time, is just showing as to whether you are in a growth part of the cycle or a shrinkage part of the cycle in terms of the economy. Now, the first thing to assume, and as often assumed, is that growth in the economy is a universal good for all organizations. Now, in the round, for the vast majority of people, growth in an economy is a positive thing for business, as typically there is more money to be spent by consumers, and this leads to a general uptick in their performance. However, there have been organizations, or are organizations, that fare quite well during times of economic downturn. So for instance, if we go back to the 2008 economic crash, you would have seen organizations such as Lidl's and Aldi's actually grow their share of the market to around about 5.5%, which is a significant amount in a large market such as food and non-food retail. And they've actually managed to sustain this over the longer term as people change their habits premised on an economic downturn. So boom and bust can actually be good times for organizations depending on the sorts of organizations you're running. In 2008, for instance, it would have been a much tougher time if you were in the automotive industry and you were trying to sell cars to people, new cars to people, anywhere from your ordinary family saloon up to a Ferrari. It would have been a more difficult sell to people who were finding they were more cash strapped than they ordinarily would be. It's important consideration as well is the exchange rate between different currencies. So we've seen this happen in recent years, some fluctuations in the value of the pound. Well, not so much fluctuation as a lowering of the value of the pound from where it was previously. Now, again, the knee-jerk reaction is often to assume that a downturn in the value of the pound is a universally bad thing, or the downturn in the value of your home currency, as it were, would be a bad thing. But it does depend on which side of the fence you're operating on. So, if the value of the pound drops, then purchasing from overseas becomes more expensive as your pound doesn't go as far. Though, if you're exporting, then all of a sudden, the value, excuse me, if you're exporting, then the attractiveness to other countries to buy your products actually goes up. So you may find yourself selling more of a particular product. So we've seen examples of this in recent years with a drop in the value of the pound, and a company, Tata Steel, which is local to us, and many of you would have seen it on your drive down the M4. The drop in the value of the pound meant that steel was therefore, British steel, or steel from Britain, was therefore cheaper for those organisations outside of the United Kingdom to buy, and that actually went some of the way to salvaging a struggling Tata Steel in the UK. And it's also important to consider the differing values of wages and the differing economic situations around the globe as well. So you would have seen lots of companies, big companies, multinational organizations that have put their headquarters in countries that are far away from their home countries, or put significant operating branches there. So let's say Apple, for instance, have set up in Dublin and Cork for taxation reasons. But then you have organizations such as Nike, who may reside in the USA, but at the same time have a great deal of their manufacturing happening in Bangladesh, for instance, where the cost of labor is significantly lower. So the economic standing of nations at different parts of the world at different times also has an economic impact as part of this pestle analysis. So social covers a great deal of different types of information. So part of this would be demographic information, for instance. So let's take any country at random, and you could look at, is it an aging population? And if it is an aging population is generally then, it tends to be that older end of that population that has control of most of the money. Or is it a country that is mostly male or mostly female? As you see from the graphic in front of you here, 51% have college degrees in Germany compared to the United States of America. So how does that impact you as an organization when you're trying to sell to people, when you're looking at the environment that you're trying to operate in? Knowing these demographics is an important thing. So as aging demographics, race, color, creed, all of these things have an impact in one way or another, or possibly have an impact in one way or another on how we buy and sell to people. And there'll be minority demographics within even larger populations as well, and we can target those then in a way that allows us to make our product or service more saleable. And as well, it's important to consider not just the hard and fast demographics, but the general social environment. So I'm sure you'd agree that the world is a very different place as it would have been for your parents when they were your age, and certainly for your grandparents. The social mores have altered, the way we interact with each other has altered, and a great deal of our beliefs and behaviours have altered as well. And there's also the notion of being part of subcultures. So you can see the small cartoon graphic along the bottom, and you have people who are punks and goths and all sorts of different demographic groups in here, and we are able to subdivide that society into its interests, and then we are able then to make suppositions as to the things that they want and desire, and particularly from an organization's point of view, that subdivision possibly aids with targeting your marketing more effectively. So, technological, a very big notion, of course, and I do hasten to add that you do not have to be a technology company to be affected by technology, and it really isn't about that. So if you were running a factory that produced paper clips or bottled water or a simple product, you would still be making use of technology, and that making use of technology could be from the manufacturing process itself, or considering, let's say, Evian water, which is basically bottled water, they're still likely to have a social media presence on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So this is still the utilization of technology. So it has a ubiquitous effect right the way across the board. All organizations, no matter what it is you produce or do, will still be affected by technology in one way or another. So environmental obviously a more pressing issue in this generation than it has ever been in the past, and has a number of impacts on organizations in this modern era. The strictures are getting far greater from the government as there are stronger and more enforceable legislation and rules around what companies can emit into the atmosphere. But again, you can see how there are crossovers and different links within this element of the PESTEL framework. So we could think back to Donald Trump, for instance, and removing America from its previous obligations under the climate change obligations that it had previously, largely for trying to stimulate the American economy. But then we would have seen other nations push more for a greener environment. And I think as well, we've also seen a social and societal change towards consumers making, where they can and where they can afford to, making choices that are premised on organizations that are doing good things to or for the environment, or at least not doing any harm or damage. And legal as well. So the laws of the country in which you're operating are obviously going to have an impact on you as an organization, and again, where you are in the world will mean different rules and regulations, and how well regulated or how much there is regulation in place in that particular industry. So if we took the financial industry in particular here, we've seen vacillations over the last 20, 30, 40 years with a variety of acts in place that have meant that the financial markets have had greater regulation or less regulation, and that has an impact on how people behave within that market, but also has an impact on when economic booms and busts happen or don't. So again, you can see some of the interrelation between these various aspects of the PESTEL framework. So again, a couple of videos for you guys here to watch.